On October 28, 1894, a man named Cornelius Halbird died alone in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago. He was 67 years old. The doctor's report listed pneumonia. The newspapers ran no obituary, and there was no funeral notice in the architectural journals he had written for over 40 years. Just 3 weeks earlier, this same man had stood in front of the Demolition Committee for the world's Columbian Exposition and refused to sign the order to bring it all down. He told them the buildings were not theirs to destroy and that they did not understand what they had been hired to remove. On the night before he died, he wrote one last letter to his daughter, Edith. In that letter, he wrote 7 words that would get every copy of his private journal seized within the year. 7 words that the Chicago Historical Society spent the next 4 decades trying to erase from the public record. This is the story of the last architect who refused the 1894 World's Fair demolition and what he said before dying. Cornelius Halbird was not a famous architect. He was a structural surveyor. His job, which he had done for almost 40 years, was to walk through buildings and determine what was holding them up. He worked on courthouses in Boston, the Capitol building extensions in Albany, and 3 different cathedrals along the eastern seaboard, including one that historians today still cannot fully explain. In 1891, at the age of 64, when most men in his profession were preparing to retire, the Planning Commission for the upcoming Chicago World's Fair pulled him out of semi-retirement and gave him a very specific assignment. They did not hire him to design or build anything. They hired him to inspect. His first day on the site was March 14, 1891. According to his journal, which his daughter managed to hide before the seizures began, he arrived expecting to find a massive construction site. Instead, he found buildings already standing. The official story, repeated for over a century, is that the entire White City of the Chicago World's Fair was constructed in roughly 22 months. This included 200 buildings, some of them larger than anything ever built in America at that point. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building alone was the largest enclosed structure on Earth at the time, spacious enough to fit the United States Capitol building inside with room to spare. The public was told that this entire complex, with its massive domes, soaring arches, and intricate interior craftsmanship, was thrown together in less than 2 years using temporary materials. Halbird did not believe that story. From the first day he walked the grounds, he wrote that something was fundamentally wrong with the timeline. The foundations he inspected did not match the construction records he had been given. The stonework in the basement levels of several buildings showed weathering patterns he associated with structures at least 80 to 100 years old. In an entry dated April 2, 1891, he noted that the drainage tunnels under the Court of Honor showed sediment buildup consistent with decades of use, not weeks. When he brought this up to his supervisor, Henry Bagster, the chief of the Engineering Oversight Committee, Bagster told him to mind his own business. He was hired to certify structural integrity for the demolition timeline, not to ask questions about how the buildings had been put up in the first place. But Halbird kept writing. The more he walked the grounds during the alleged construction phase, the more he suspected that what was actually happening on the Chicago lakefront was not construction, but renovation. It was the dressing up of massive buildings that had been there long before the Planning Commission was ever formed. His journal entries from the summer of 1891 describe a pattern. He would arrive early in the morning before the crews showed up to inspect the structures alone. He noticed that the so-called staff material, the plaster and jute fiber mixture, which the official record claims was used to build the exteriors, was merely being applied as a coating on top of a pre-existing structure. He pulled a sample from the back wall of what would later become the Palace of Fine Arts. Underneath the white plaster coating, he found cut limestone, properly dressed, mortared, and set into a wall pattern he recognized from his work on permanent government buildings decades earlier. He wrote about this discovery to a colleague in Philadelphia, an engineer named Albert Renwick. In the letter dated September 9, 1891, Halbird stated his belief that the Palace of Fine Arts had been a finished masonry building before the Fair Commission ever touched it. He believed the temporary plaster coating was being used to disguise the original construction and to give the public a reason to accept its demolition after the fair closed. As Halbird pointed out, you cannot easily justify tearing down a permanent stone building that the public would consider highly valuable, but you can absolutely justify tearing down a temporary plaster building that was always meant to be disposable. Renwick wrote back, and his letter survived because Edith kept it folded inside her father's Bible. In his reply, he confessed that he had seen the exact same thing in Philadelphia at the Centennial Exhibition site 16 years earlier, where several temporary fair buildings possessed stone cores that no one in the official record could account for. Renwick had been told to stop asking questions, and he warned Halbird to do the same. Halbird did not stop. By the spring of 1892, his role on the site quietly shifted. He was no longer assigned to inspect new buildings. Instead, he was assigned to document the demolition plans. The commission wanted him to walk through each building, sign off on its structural integrity for the duration of the fair, and certify it for safe demolition once the event ended. But Halbird stopped doing the job he was paid for and began measuring everything. He measured foundation depths, wall thicknesses, the spacing of support columns, and the proportions of the arches and domes. In entry after entry, he wrote that none of these measurements matched the published plans. The entry building, officially designed by Richard Morris Hunt, had a dome that was supposed to be 220 feet tall, but Halbird measured it at an average height of 277 feet. The machinery hall had an entire basement level that was not on any plan he was given access to. He found a way down into it through a service stairwell behind one of the boilers. What he saw down there is described in 3 pages of his journal that his daughter later sewed into the lining of her winter coat. These pages describe a basement underneath the machinery hall that extended at least 60 feet below grade, featuring cut stone arches, brick vaulting, and a series of interconnected chambers running parallel to the lakefront. He noted that the air down there was warmer than it should have been, that several chambers had iron doors that had been recently welded shut, and that a series of circular openings in the floor had been capped with concrete plugs no more than 6 months old. He made rough sketches and measurements, concluding that this layout was not part of the fair. It had been there before, and someone up the chain of command had decided the public was never going to know it existed. By November of 1892, Halbird's tone shifted from professional observation to deep anxiety. He noted that he was being followed by men in dark coats, his office had been ransacked, and his notebooks had been examined. He drafted a will leaving everything to his daughter, giving her separate instructions to remove his master journal, a small wooden box under his floorboards, and a sealed envelope addressed to a journalist named Theodore Whitney. That envelope contained a list of 23 buildings across the United States that Halbird believed had been constructed decades or centuries before their official cornerstone dates, including the United States Capitol and the California State Capitol in Sacramento. Halbird did not claim to know who built them. He was simply reporting that the structural numbers and weathering patterns did not align with official history. He became convinced that the entire purpose of the World's Fair was to provide a public, theatrical reason to destroy ancient structures along the lake shoreline. When the Exposition closed in October of 1893, the demolition phase began. In January of 1894, Halbird was called before the Demolition Oversight Committee to sign a master document certifying that the buildings of the Court of Honor held no historical or architectural value and were ready for destruction. He refused. According to private journals of other surveyors present, Halbird stood up and declared that he could not in professional conscience sign off on destroying buildings that contained core masonry predating the founding of Chicago by at least a century, calling it the destruction of evidence. By the next 9 months, Halbird tried to publish his findings, but his letters to journals and senators were ignored or returned without a comment. He spent his remaining days compiling his measurements into a master journal. On October 19, 1894, he suddenly fell ill with a severe fever and cough. He kept writing until his final entry on October 27, where he noted the completion of his document and expressed hope that someone in the future would walk into the surviving buildings, measure them, and see the truth. He died the next night. When his daughter found him, his body had been moved, and his master journal and wooden box were completely missing from the apartment. However, his final letter to Edith, hidden beneath the floorboards, survived. It contained the 7 words that powerful organizations tried for decades to suppress. Addressing the grand architecture of the Exposition, Halbird wrote, "They tore down what we did not build." He did not name a lost empire or a specific civilization. He simply stated, in the plainest engineering terms, that the magnificent structures of the World's Fair were not built by the men who took credit for them. They were merely taken down by them to ensure the true history of the land remained buried forever.